Okay. Hopefully you see my slide deck. I saw Microsoft put a tweet out yesterday. Can you see my screen okay? Imagine how many times that's been said over the last few months.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good deal. So I'll speak and share with you for about an hour or so, and at any point in time, any questions, comments, concerns, curiosities, hit me up. I've got my note window and my other monitor, so if I'm unable to answer a question at the time, I'm going to track it down and I can post it on Twitter or follow up with you individually. This is Azure Active Directory in all its many forms. And specifically, what we're going to do is first make sure that we understand exactly what Azure AD is. I find this is an initial challenge with customers who are accustomed to Windows Server AD, assuming, because it's Microsoft, that Azure AD is the same thing. Besides being an identity store, that's about the only similarity. I also want to make sure that we're clear on the relationship between Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Cloud Platform subscriptions. I find that trust relationship often is a fuzzy concept for people. I know it was for me. Then going to survey to make sure you understand all of the Azure AD offerings that are available in a platform as a service context. Of course, there's always infrastructure as a service, standing up a good old domain controller VM in a virtual network. And also I'm here, of course, to answer your questions. All right, session materials. The materials just consist of a PDF of this slideshow. If you'd like it, you can grab it right now. What you see on the screen is a short link, timw.info/Omaha. And I believe that'll link directly to the PDF. I'll make sure to show that link at the end of the session as well, and I'm 99% sure Vaibhav already has it. So first of all, defining and differentiating Azure AD. I've put together a brief comparison, a bullet point comparison between Windows Server AD, also known as Active Directory Domain Services, versus Azure Active Directory. First, there's the directory service itself. I mean, Windows Server, local, on-premises identity store, Azure AD, a cloud-based identity store, unless you're in Azure Stack. LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol, is the type of directory that Windows Server is, but Azure AD is a web service. It uses the Microsoft Graph REST API. Again, a point of initial confusion I remember at first. Why isn't Azure AD part of the AZ commands in the PowerShell module library, and why isn't it part of Azure Resource Manager? It kind of is. But the API is separate because we have to remember that Azure AD is used as an identity store for other products besides Azure. Authentication protocols, we know on-prem we've got Kerberos and NTLM. With Azure AD, it's all about token-based identity federation and federation trust relationships. Windows Server, we're accustomed to a hierarchical DNS-based namespace, the forest and the domain trees, whereas with Azure AD, it's just a monolithic or flat identity store. In terms of trust, in Windows Server, you've got your forest trusts, your transitive domain trusts, etc. It's all proprietary, isn't it? Yes, it's LDAP. Yes, it's using Kerberos and some, open source-ish components, but largely it's proprietary. Azure AD, we're talking federation trust. Trust between Azure AD tenants, trust between your Azure AD tenant and a third-party identity store like Google or Twitter. We'll get into more about that momentarily. In Windows Server, of course, there's groups and organizational units. In Azure AD, there is groups. In fact, dynamic groups are pretty compelling. I'm a big fan of those. I'm sure we'll have a look at those as we get into the demo. But there's no OUs. There's no structuring, which can present some issues in a hybrid cloud. For instance, if you're using Azure AD Connect to bring users from multiple local AD domains into a single tenant, they're all going to go into the same list. Lastly, there's the concept of management, user device management. Group policy has been our standard in Windows Server since late 1999. Azure AD, there's no group policy concept directly, although we do have mobile device management, endpoint management through Microsoft Intune, or I guess the latest name for that is Microsoft Endpoint Management. Microsoft is doing their thing with renaming, aren't they? That tends to be a 24/7, 365 thing. This is a really cool flow chart I found in the Azure documentation. when I reproduce an image or something, you'll see in the corner of my slide there's an attribution where you can go to the source page. This breaks down what an app registration is and how it's distinct from a service principal. I guess we can take a step back. When we think of Azure AD as an identity store, I think of it as where your Azure users are, but also if you're using Microsoft 365, Office 365 licenses, they could be using those products as well, but thinking about human beings and interactive sign-in. Well, in local AD, we have the service account, the managed service account, the group managed service account. In Azure, we have a similar construct called the service principal. And when we want an application to rely upon Azure Active Directory, one of the first things we need to do is create a registration in the tenant for the app. And so what you see here, I'll just try to sum up what's happening in this diagram. We've got the home tenant, A-Datum, is making a multi-tenant application. And so they create an application definition in their local tenant. It also has a service principal. This again is a common point of confusion because in the Azure AD blade, you've got the Enterprise Applications blade and the App Registrations blade. The registration is in App Registrations, the service principal is in the Enterprise Applications blade. And what we'll see is as you expand the scope of that application such that other companies can federate with it, they'll also have an entry for your application in their Azure AD tenant, but only in the Enterprise Applications blade, and that will be their copy of the service principal. So you can see that there's one canonical application definition in the home tenant, and there's a home service principal that you can use to give the application access to resources, to give your users access to your application. But then when other customers are consuming that application, they will have a service principal entity in their tenant as well. All right, so a couple more slides and then it's demo time. This again, I think, is a really useful illustration because it shows the relationship between the various Microsoft Cloud Platform subscriptions and the Azure AD tenant. A tenant, we could also look at that word as an instance. It's just simply a copy of the Azure Active Directory identity store. But what we see here is that one tenant, let me bring my drawing tools out here, I've kind of missed them. One tenant can be trusted by multiple Azure subscriptions. Here we have an Azure subscription, and let me just do another subscription, another subscription. Why would a business have multiple subscriptions? Well, chiefly in order to give isolation right up to the cost level. And anything under that subscription scope, namely resource groups and resources, would be under the owners of that subscription. But we can simplify identity and access by sharing, having a trust relationship with that single tenant. And again, as we mentioned earlier, Azure AD is also used with Microsoft 365 and Dynamics 365. So we can apply licenses from those platforms in our tenant, give them to our Azure AD users, and they can transparently access resources across the Microsoft Cloud Platform. Questions, comments, concerns thus far? All right, so let's pop. Was there a question? I don't mean to talk over anybody.
No, I was just saying, no, not yet. I think all is good.
Okay, so let's come into the tenant here. What was I going to do? Create a new tenant, transfers. Okay, right. So first there's the concept of multi-tenancy, the fact that Azure Active Directory is called a multi-tenant identity store. And I like to look at that through a couple different lenses. On one hand, it's multi-tenant because your users list may be associated with different domains, different organizations, because as I said, this is just a flat user pool. It's also multi-tenant because we can have more than one tenant associated in our environment. In fact, we can deploy those tenants at any time just by heading out over to the Azure Marketplace and doing a search for Azure Active Directory. And after the pause finishes here, we've got templates here for Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. So there brings a distinction right there. When would you choose one or the other? Well, first of all, question 0 would be the first person who started the subscription comes in with a Microsoft account. you create a free account, an Azure account, and you land into your portal with a fresh copy of Azure AD that has the label default directory in all likelihood. And so your account is sourced in the Microsoft account database, so you've got federation happening right out of the box. You're the only user in that tenant. Eventually, you rename the label, you associate your business DNS domain with your tenant, and you're rocking and you're rolling, and you're starting to develop and deploy resources. What if that new application that you're developing will be backed by Azure AD, but you don't want any of the users of that app to be in your tenant? You need that layer of separation. Hence, the ability to deploy additional instances of Azure Active Directory. So if we go into the creation experience here, we'll see that there's the friendly organizational name, that's the label. Then there's the globally unique host name of your domain. I heard a rumor that eventually customers will be able to change this, but this is going to be tattooed on your tenant forever and ever at this point. So it could be something really non-intuitive or embarrassing. So that's all the more reason to apply your custom domain to the tenant. And like any other public cloud service, all of those DNS names are internet accessible, something.onmicrosoft.com. And then there's the region and create, and within a few minutes, you're ready to switch to that tenant. Just like the cooking shows, I already have one prepared that I can pull out of the oven. We can use the directory and subscription filter down here to switch our directory. And my user here, Tim at timw.info, I created this AZ104 class tenant. So I should be the only user account in that tenant right now. You'll see below the DNS name, we have the object ID, the GUID for the tenant ID, which is essentially a GUID. And you'll wind up using that a lot when you're programmatically interacting with Azure Active Directory. Now, do I have my phone so I can answer this MFA prompt? Let me see. I do. 867-5309? Yeah, that's the ticket. 567679. There. Fun fact, my wife and I were in Nashville no longer than 6 months, and we were working out at our local gym, and we got in a conversation with a guy, and turns out he was the guy who wrote 867-5309. You pretty much trip over musicians in Nashville. So here we are in that tenant, and when you create a new Azure AD tenant, it's just a shell. I mean, it's a directory service, but you can't do anything with it unless and until you've attached at least one subscription, and I don't have any subscriptions here. So that means no matter what I try to do, whether it's a virtual machine, I get this, basically an advertisement. It's an inert, empty directory. Now that doesn't mean you're totally stuck until you attach a subscription. We can still do work within the tenant. Recall that Azure Active Directory runs at the free tier by default. Here it is, Azure AD Free, which has some generous features. You can do hybrid identity with it. You can register, I believe, up to 10 applications. It's pretty fair, but just like any other service in Azure, if you're really going to start relying on it, you're going to want to go to a standard or perhaps premium tier. And with Azure AD, it's typically premium P1 or premium P2, depending on what you want to do. If we go over to users, we see me, that's the original user, and notice that my source is external Azure Active Directory. The source is where the user's actually being authenticated. And again, Federation Trust, because this account actually is sourced in my timw.info directory. And this second account I must have created right in here, named Tom. Note that his source is Azure AD. So you can tell where the user comes from by looking at their source, and their user type is either going to be member or guest. Again, federation all day long. We've got the new user and new guest user, although I imagine this new guest user is going to disappear, because if we go to create a new user, we can do a guest user right here by clicking this Invite User Radio button. What are the high-level differences here? Well, the user is going to be sourced in the tenant, whereas an invited user is coming in through what's called Azure Active Directory Business-to-Business Collaboration, or Azure AD B2B for short. And the invitation workflow is pretty interesting. The idea is that if you don't want to create a native local cloud user for that person. You can invite them in as an outsider. They may be homed in another Azure AD tenant, or they may be completely outside the organization, IBM.com, Oracle.com, and I'm using those email addresses intentionally. And they'll receive an email invitation welcoming them to the directory if they accept the invitation. We can give a personal message. We can do some management here, Azure AD group membership, role-based access control, Azure AD, suspend sign-ins until you've approved them, usage location, etc. So when we do the invitation, the user initially shows up in the tenant with a source of invited user. What happens when the user redeems the invitation? Well, it's a little different if you can optionally do federation, a separate federation flow with Gmail, and I only learned of this a couple days ago, so I really don't know much. Normally, the party line is the user is going to be prompted to either create a Microsoft account using that email ID if they don't have one, or if they already have a Microsoft account that uses that ID, they can reuse it and continue that way. But either way, at the end of the Azure AD B2B redemption process, the user comes in here with a source. In fact, we can switch back to the other directory. I've got lots of other examples on that. They'll come in as a Microsoft account as their source. Let's go back to Azure AD. Yeah, down here, this Gmail account right here, I'm coming in as a guest Microsoft account. I've also got one here that's guest invited user to show the different options. So you've got Azure AD, you've got invited user, you've got Microsoft account. If you do a guest invitation and they're already in an Azure AD tenant, they come in with external Azure AD as their source. And lastly, if you're using Azure AD Connect to synchronize accounts from your local AD into Azure AD, those users come in with a Windows Server AD source. Now, what are the differences between member and guest? The only difference I've been able to identify between the member and the guest user type is the visibility that the user gets if they are allowed to sign into the portal. If a user can sign into the portal and they're a member, they can come in here to this screen and they can look at the properties, the profile properties of other users. But if a guest does the same thing and they come to this screen, they won't be able to see anybody. In fact, I don't even think the other users show up. And that's just meant, I guess, as a privacy mechanism to denote the difference. But as far as role membership goes, there's absolutely no difference. I mean, let's look here. We've got this Zoe Warner as a guest. So Zoe was a contractor. We invited her in as a guest, and now she needs some level of authorization to work in our resource group. We can come to Access Control IAM as we normally do, and we can add a role assignment, whatever that is. What is this, a resource group? Let's just say we're going to let her swing a fairly heavy hammer here, contributor. And we'll be able to resolve her ID as a guest just as much as we could a native identity, or just as much someone who's been synchronized from local AD. I just want to hammer home that fact that they're all the same from an authorization standpoint. So far we've been dealing with human beings, haven't we? Users and groups. It's a lot we could get into with users. And like I said, any questions, you hit me with them and I'll do my best to answer. About the Azure AD groups, what I wanted to show you here is the dynamic group that I think is pretty cool. You know, typically you create a group in Azure AD for the same reason you would in local AD, to organize users and to make access and authorization simpler. Same thing. But in Azure AD groups, there's a couple other neat things you can layer on there to make that even easier, automated. Specifically, if you create the group as a dynamic group, you then determine by creating a membership rule how Azure will populate it. That is, when you create a dynamic group, you can't even add users manually. You have to let Azure do it. And it boils down to an evaluation based on Azure AD user properties. So in this example, I created a London Cloud Users group that looks at the city property, and if it equals London, the user is automatically populated into this group. Let's see if there's any members. Edgar Allan Poe. Well, he was an American, I don't know, and he's been dead for well over 100 years. The other thing that I like about this is the ability to distribute licenses at the group level. So for example, I've used the add license command here to bring in my Microsoft 365 E5 licenses, such that here, if we bring a user into this tenant, if their city is London, they will A, be added to this group, which may in turn be granted access to applications, and B, they're already going to get licenses here. So in this case, Edgar Allan Poe, who is edgar@timw.info, is going to automatically get access to those applications. Edgar@timw. Well, let's open a new in private window. And I don't know if you're familiar with the application access panel. It's myapps.microsoft.com, but there's actually a new experience called myapplications.microsoft.com. And that's a well-known endpoint. And the idea is the user will sign in with their Azure AD cred. And notice here, we're just at a generic endpoint here, login.microsoftonline.com. But again, federation is coming to help here. As soon as we hit next, watch what happens. My corporate branding shows up because Azure immediately, or Microsoft I should say, immediately identified this ID as being part of the timw.info directory. And hopefully I know the password here. Let me try. Nuts. Let me try one more time. Oh, wonderful. Well, I'll tell you, I can easily reset it. Let's go into Edgar's profile and let's reset the password. And I'm going to copy it to clipboard. And let's reset it. Sign in. So as I was saying, the applications access panel is essentially, it's like Okta. It's an SSO, single sign-on portal. And the idea is as you're deploying and maintaining cloud apps, and my understanding of Microsoft's understanding of cloud apps is that it's any form factor of an app, a desktop app, a mobile app, what are some other form factors? Whatever the form is, it doesn't matter, but does it use Azure AD as its identity store? That's what makes it a cloud app. And if that's true, and if the app is registered with your tenant, you can give users access to the app here through the application access panel. And because Edgar has access to the Microsoft 365 licenses, we've got federated SSO where we can go immediately and transparently into those apps. Well, that's easy enough to demonstrate for Office 365 apps, but what about the process of the application registration and apps, Azure AD apps that you're actually developing in-house, let's say? What's the high-level workflow for that? Well, for that, like I said, we've got two blades to be concerned with. We've got in the tenant, we've got app registrations and enterprise applications. So our developers are going to need to create a registration for that app, whatever it is. We can create, I'll call this Omaha User Group App. It says that this can be changed later, that's fine. And then here, this determines the authentication scope of the app, and it defaults to accounts only in the local directory, that's single tenancy. We also could open it up to in any organizational directory, so we could federate and allow users not only from this directory, but other Azure AD tenants to come in, or accounts in any directory. This is the default way that Azure AD itself works. You've got the guest flow where you come in as a Microsoft account, otherwise you have to be in the tenant. Now you might be thinking, well, what if we're actually going to develop a mobile app that's going to be customer facing, and we want to support things like profiles and in-app purchases? We're going to make so much money, we're going to just have the time of our lives. Is this Azure Active Directory really the best fit for that? Well, hold on to that thought for a second. You provide a real or placeholder URL that's just going to be where the user is redirected after they sign in. So I'm creating the shell of that application here. And in the app registrations blade, this is where you can get to certain settings, and you can review some metadata that your developers are definitely going to need all the time. The application has its friendly name, but really internally in your source code, you're going to use the application ID, also called the client ID. You can look at that as the username of the app. And almost always you're going to need the directory or the tenant ID as well. Another thing is if you're going to give the application itself access to other Azure resources, it needs to identify itself, doesn't it? How does it do that? Normally you use the app ID as the user field, and then you either have a password or a digital certificate. So we can create a password or a secret here and give it an optional expiration. Azure generates it for you. It's one of those deals that if you don't copy it to your clipboard, you'll never see the plain text again. So, and you can always create another one if that happens, but that's one of the two main ways that the app, that is, can identify itself elsewhere in Azure for authorization purposes. Okay, where was I going with this? Yeah, if we step out of the app registrations blade, let me see if I can get back to my tenant from here. Yeah, we've got the enterprise applications list. And again, I still think it's a little bit confusing, maybe a little bit more than a little bit. But this is where the service principal is. So what we can do here in this list is filter for Omaha. And what we can do here, among other things, note that I'm not a developer. I kind of am a wannabe developer, but I've been an infrastructure specialist for the last 20 plus years. This is where Microsoft gives your developers a little bit of help in terms of access. You can do role-based access control within your application, but in order to make the app available to users on that access panel, this is where you have to do it. And the enterprise application blade and the service principal for the app, this is where you can browse your directory to bring in groups and or individual users. So if we wanted to give the Edgar user the ability to single sign-on into this Azure AD app, this is a step that we would have to complete. And again, that app will appear on the access panel for them. Let's see. Any questions, comments, concerns thus far? Curiosities?
The only thing Steve mentioned was that these could also be on-prem applications on the portal.
Yes, thank you. Right. When I use the term cloud app, it's regardless of the form factor. It can be a desktop app that you're actually going to deploy to your endpoints in an on-premises environment. Doesn't matter at all where the app is or what its form is. The whole idea, though, is that you're authenticating against Azure AD. And the fact that you've got a registration for your app unlocks all sorts of great access possibilities, because you may need your application to access storage accounts. It might need to go into Key Vault to fetch secrets or store data there. There's all sorts of integrations. And that brings up yet another idea, and that is the managed service identity. If you do a search, well, first of all, let's go to virtual machines. Let's say you've got a virtual machine and it's running source code. Let's node one machine. I wish they weren't all stopped. Shouldn't be a problem. But let's say we've got code on this node one machine and it needs to interact with, say, a Key Vault. Maybe it needs to authenticate into an Azure Key Vault to fetch a secret, right? How are your developers going to facilitate that kind of authentication? Again, Microsoft really does a lot of work to help developers out in particular. The concept of system managed identity. There are a number of Azure services that support this. It's not the majority, but a lot of them do, databases, virtual machines. And the idea here is that you can have Azure create a service principal for the virtual machine itself. All we have to do is flip the status from off to on and click Save. It says Node 1 will be registered with Azure AD, and we can then grant it permissions. So in a moment now, we've got an object ID, that's the globally unique identifier to reference this object. And there's a button to do permissions from here. The thing about the system assigned managed identity is that it lives with the resource. That is to say, if we delete this Node 1 virtual machine, Azure will automatically clean up and delete the system assigned managed identity. Now that's different from user assigned managed identities. You oftentimes can attach these to, like, if you're doing Azure policy and you need to do a remediation task, Azure policy needs a security context to do its work. A user-assigned identity is a perfect security principle to use for that. The idea with a user-assigned identity, and you can get to those separately, they're tracked in the Managed Identities blade, is that these are essentially standalone service principles that you can grant access to resources, and they're not tied permanently to the life cycle of another Azure resource like a system-assigned managed identity is. They're quite flexible, quite useful indeed. Now, to finish my thought about the virtual machine, in order to give that Node 1 machine easy authorization into a key vault, we can go into said key vault. You might know that Key Vault has two layers of authorization. There's the control plane of the vault itself, that's the access control IAM, and then there's the access policies, which is really where you get into the good stuff, the keys, secrets, and certificates. So we can add an access policy here, and we can either use a template or we can just grab permissions ad hoc. I'll just say, imagine that the VM needed secret management permissions. And then we'll select a principal, and I'll just type the name of the VM. Isn't that cool? So in addition to human beings, we can give managed identities, access to resources in our Azure subscription, as well as, wait for it, application registrations that are our line of business applications. Wow, pretty cool. Let's see, I don't think it took the VM. I think I zigged when I should have zagged, but I think you get the idea. As long as I save this change, at least this application now has a much easier authentication path into this key vault. Pretty sweet. Now, you'll recall that at the beginning, or towards the beginning, around the beginning, when we were talking about Azure Active Directory being multi-tenant, etc., and then we went into Azure AD and we looked at the app registration, I gave the scenario, what if our app in question is going to be customer facing? Do we really want to register it here? Because this is our production, our internal use tenant. And the answer to that is probably no. So then, as I showed you, you can create another instance of Azure Active Directory. But what about the other option? Azure Active, which is Azure AD B2C. What is the distinction here? Azure Active Directory B2C, B2C stands for business to consumer. It is a separate tenant of Azure Active Directory, but it's special purpose it's specially purposed, I guess I should say, for customer-facing applications. The main value propositions that Azure AD B2C brings to the table are, one, it has enhanced customizability. You know the old front page effect? Who wants to expose a sign-up page, a sign-in page, profile management page, password management pages that look like Azure? You may not want that. That may be completely against what you want in the app. You don't want to expose any of your plumbing. So B2C is designed for customizability, and just as importantly, it's got a whole bunch of plumbing built into it for working with social media identity providers. You see? So in other words, instead of your developers having to do a whole bunch of extra research and homework on identity federation, they can get well over halfway there just by using B2C. And this is going to keep track of those users, but it's going to keep them totally separate from your internal use template, or tenant rather. Let me open my directory and subscription filter again. I created a B2C tenant earlier. Let me see if I can find it in my list. Here it is, timw.info B2C. Let's switch on over to it. And again, this is very similar to the tenant that we looked at earlier, where we went into the AZ104 class, and it was just an empty tenant with just a single user account. At first blush, B2C looks a whole lot like a regular Azure AD tenant, and in many ways it is, but it does share some differences. For a regular Azure AD tenant, you can attach a subscription directly from it. Here, that doesn't appear to be the case. In other words, we're not going to be able to do anything with this tenant unless and until we've attached a subscription to it. The way we do that for B2C is different from the way we do that with just plain old garden variety Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. Let's again go back to my home tenant, timw.info, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's say that we wanted to take one of my subscriptions. I should have a few to work with here. Let's see. Let's go to the subscriptions blade. Let's say I wanted to take this training subscription 150 subscription, of which I'm an owner. That means I can do anything with it, of course. And I want to attach it. I effectively want to unplug it from timw.info, and I want to attach it to my Azure Active Directory, not B2C, but my full Azure AD tenant AZ104 class. What we can do here, as long as we're an owner, is simply on the overview page, change directory. It's amazingly easy. It's deceptively easy. We simply open the directory list, select the target tenant, and then click change. Now there's some things to keep in mind. This one up here hopefully is obvious, but if not, it says changing the directory removes all of your RBAC. That makes sense, hopefully, because if we're unplugging from this tenant and plugging into a new one, that means all the assignments that were my timw info users, they're gone because those users don't exist anymore in this second tenant. So you're going to have to redo all of your access control. Note also that changing the directory doesn't change the billing owner. That's a separate process. You can go to the subscription management portal and change the billing owner. But yeah, it doesn't, just changing the directory to another tenant doesn't make any modification to the show me the money billing owner. Lastly, there's the concept of what about resources that you've already deployed into the subscription? We can come down here into settings and go to resources. I don't think I have anything here. Do you think that Azure will carry over all these resources into the new tenant, or will it leave them behind? Or do you think there's a third option? Well, let me see. Move Azure subscription to another tenant. There's a docs article that I like. Here's one on transferring billing ownership. I think it's this one here. Add an existing Azure subscription to your Azure AD tenant, specifically the post-association steps. The answer, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but because you don't want to assume, but all of your deployed resources will in fact go. Of course, nothing's going to be deleted, but there's some gotchas to be concerned with. Here are some in this docs article. For instance, if you have any key vaults, you're going to have to update the tenant ID. That doesn't get updated automatically when you move the subscription to another tenant. And it looks like if you use system assigned managed identities, you have to recreate those. So anyway, there's just always some gotchas to be concerned with when it comes to doing that. I want to actually do this move. So let's go back to overview and let's change the directory to the AZ104 class. And then let's come back to subscriptions and let's take my Visual Studio subscription and let's change that directory to our B2C tenant. It's the same process as you can see, but actually I'm not sure if this is going to work. The docs say in order to move a subscription to the tenant, go through the marketplace, but I've always used this, so I'm just going to let this roll. I'm going to choose the B2C tenant and click change. It does take a few minutes for that update to take place, so there's going to be some latency here. Eventually, these two subscriptions are going to fall off this list, and when we sign into another of those directories, the subscriptions will be attached and we can deploy resources to our heart's content. How are we doing for time? Looking pretty good. Let me see. I think it's time to go back to the slide deck here. And let's make sure that we're up to speed on the other Azure AD services. What about Azure AD Connect? What is your relationship to hybrid identity? What is the need for this? What kind of, I'm genuinely interested actually to know your experience. Here's the situation. You've got an on-prem, whoa, my pen kind of is a little bit extreme. You've got an on-premises Active Directory environment and your users are signing in to domain joined devices. No problem. They've got their SMTP business email ID, yourcompany.com, let's say, tim@company.com, and I've got a password that's being managed locally, thank you very much, that's not going to change. However, our business is gradually expanding into the Azure cloud, and we're using, say, Office 365 apps. We're starting to develop our own cloud apps. Maybe we've got integrations with software as a service apps like Google, heaven forbid. Dropbox, even more heaven forbid. But the bottom line is that all of these cloud apps are relying on Azure AD as their sole source of identity. How can we do this? It's deceptively easy, at least at first inspection. We need to install Azure AD Connect on, I would say, at least 2 infrastructure servers in your on-premises environment. Microsoft, and I just noticed this the other day, I should have mentioned it, Vaibhav, when we were doing announcements at the beginning, but I noticed that there's a new cloud provisioning option for Azure AD Connect, which I think is fantastic, because right now, Azure AD Connect is an MSI installer that you install manually. There's no communication between Azure AD Connect instances. And so, believe it or not, and this is even on the certification exams, in order to do high availability, and I put that in quotes, you deploy Azure AD Connect on multiple local systems, but you basically have to put all but one to sleep by putting Azure AD Connect into what's called staging mode, because there's no communication among them. And if the primary goes down or you need to take it down, you would take the secondary out of staging mode and it will resume. Azure AD Connect is a free synchronization service, is all it is. And in working with Azure AD Connect, you wind up selecting users, groups, identities from your on-premises environment, and it can go across domains and even forests. And at the end of that process, they're replicated up into Azure Active Directory. That's the highest level view. It can get more complex than that. I don't know how far you want to go with that, actually. On this machine I'm teaching from, I actually have Azure AD Connect installed, and I've got synchronization going. So the way that you set it up is that you run through the wizard, and then the way you change your configuration is to simply rerun the Azure AD Connect wizard on one of your local infrastructure servers. Note that you're going to have top-of-the-line credentials to set this up. Hopefully that makes sense. You're going to need to be a global administrator in Azure AD, and it used to be that you had to be an enterprise admin level account in local AD, but Microsoft appears to have changed that a bit. So once you've got Azure AD Connect and synchronization going, you can come in and you can change any of these settings. And here's the staging mode, for instance. The user sign-in is the piece where the really big decisions come in terms of how you're doing the synchronization and pros and cons to different approaches. It's like this. You've got 3 main options to choose from. You've got password hash, which is really the simplest way to go. It's simple and very easy, actually. There's pass-through authentication, which is very similar to password hash synchronization, but it has a couple important differences. And then third, if you're using Active Directory Federation services, you can continue to use that farm to do true single sign-in using SAML tokens. And if you don't have ADFS deployed in your on-premises environment, this wizard will actually do most of the work of setting up the farm for you. I'm really impressed with the engineering in this application. Cliff Notes version of the distinction between password hash and pass-through. Let me do it this way. Here's L, that's your local domain environment. Here's A, here's your Azure AD. You do not need a VPN or an express route link. This is going to work over TCP port 443 over the internet. And your Azure AD Connect, depending upon which of these options, is going to do one of 2 things. Password hash synchronization is going to replicate the user and a hash of their password hash to the cloud. And the idea is there's a lot more to this, but ideally, you want to make sure that the user's UPN or user principal name in the domain matches their business email address, because you're kind of tricking your users. You're going to, at the end of this process, say, okay, user, you're going to sign into Office 365 using your business email address and your normal company password. Really what's going on is that you've reformatted potentially the UPN of your domain such that their sign-in name looks like their SMTP email, And by default, it's that UPN that becomes the sign-in property for the user in Azure AD. So again, the user thinks he or she is submitting an email address. It looks, it's the string matches, but it's really an Azure AD sign-in name. And I said hash of a hash. Note that password hash synchronization, Azure AD will take the local hash of the password and hash it again and store that in the cloud. That's to satisfy customers whose security and compliance requirements are like, nope, we can't have local password hashes in the cloud because if an attacker does a rainbow table attack or something and they compromise local, that means our cloud is compromised, or if they compromise cloud, that means the local is compromised. So it's a hash of a hash. So that's still not good enough for some customers. Pass-through authentication is similar to password hash. The user goes up into the cloud, but no password is stored in the cloud for the user. Aha. That can be a big problem, I hope you see, because if something happens with that communications channel, if you're using PHS, password hash synchronization, the user can still continue to SSO into cloud apps because their sign-in name and their password hash are present. If you're doing pass-through authentication, they're hosed because there's no password stored in the cloud. Again, that's to satisfy businesses and customers whose security prevents any password hashes of local users being stored in the cloud. Lastly, one more thing. Pass-through requires that you install a service on your on-premises environment. It's called a pass-through authentication agent, and it basically serves as an authentication proxy. The user provides their sign-in and their password to the cloud app. Azure AD Connect encrypts that data, sends it down through the communication channel. It gets picked up by a pass-through authentication agent, unpacks the credentials, verifies the users in local AD, then the user is signed in. You can speed up password hash sync or pass-through sync by ticking this box here for a seamless single sign-on. This is potentially very cool because your local user can literally pop open their browser, go to Office 365 or go to your cloud app, and they may not even be prompted for any credentials. They'll be taken right in. The downside to that is that it requires that the user be signing in on a domain-joined machine in their local domain environment. You need that Kerberos trust channel between the workstation and your domain controllers. And number two, when you tick this box, Azure AD will create a computer account in your domain, and your security and infrastructure people may not like that. That's going to be a high-value computer account because it's a Kerberos proxy to handle those authentications. That makes some semblance of sense? So that's a quick review of Azure Active Directory Connect. Some other things that you can do here, you can do the custom or the express. Don't go to express. Custom is going to allow you to pick and choose which users you're going to put into the cloud and which ones you aren't. If you do express, everybody, including service accounts, is going to the cloud. Is that what you want? Probably not. Let's come back here and see. This is the business-to-business collaboration flow. We've already been through this. Here's a representative screen from Azure AD B2C, business to consumer. It's showing A, the customized experience, and B, it's showing the identity federation. This is a big deal when you think about it. I mean, how many times have you gone to the iOS store or the Google Play Store and you've downloaded an app and you're really excited to use it, and in order to save state and do integrated purchases, etc., you have to create an account and you have to choose a username or type your full email, retype your email, choose a password. Oh, it's not strong enough. Choose it again. Retype it. Oh, you mistyped it. Type it again. Now we're going to send you a text or email verification. Now, what is your blood type? Where do you live? That's no good. We're accustomed to this, aren't we? Again, federated identity, where we've got an identity provider that's actually doing the authentication. Azure AD B2C supports like 6 providers. And again, a lot of the programming is already done for your developers. And the user can simply create their account and manage their profile without having to worry about all of this friction. They can just sign in with their existing Microsoft, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn account. Nice experience. And so there's a value prop for customer-based or customer-facing applications with business to consumer. You might have heard of Azure AD Domain Services. What the heck is this? Is this a replacement for Active Directory Domain Services? Not really, I don't think. How can I be diplomatic? It feels a little half-baked, to be perfectly honest with you. Here's the situation. An Azure AD Domain Services domain is what's called a managed domain, as you can see over here. You deploy this resource, and it's always attached to a specific virtual network. It goes on its own subnet normally. Your user base is still in Azure AD. So it's not like you would set up a VM and you might create a new Active Directory Domain Services forest, and you've got full control of that whole environment. If it's a forest, then you can extend the schema. You can do anything you want to do in that environment. This is a platform as a service offering that really has pretty specific use cases. If you need domain join and traditional group policy-based management, LDAP access, Kerberos NTLM authentication, this can do that even in a hybrid cloud environment. Another thing that you can do with Azure AD Domain Services is establish your managed domain as a resource. I was going to say a resource forest, but you don't get access to the forest. It's called a managed domain. You don't get the ability to modify the schema, but you can create a one-way trust with your local Active Directory in order to give on-premises users access to resources that are available in Azure. Now, like I said, you could really do the same thing just with Azure AD Connect into Azure AD. That's where I personally can't wrap my mind around this 100% yet. So you deploy the Azure AD Domain Services instance into a virtual network, and you need Azure AD because that's where your identities are actually going to be. Specifically, Microsoft will use, I guess it might be using Azure AD Connect under the hood, I don't know, but it will do an automatic background sync of your identities from Azure AD into your managed domain. And yes, you then can connect. You could fire up a VM, let's say, that's in this virtual network, and you can join the domain just like you normally do with the system control panel or PowerShell or whatever. And you can fire up the server manager or the admin, whatever that admin center thing is called, that browser-based management tool, and you can get to group policy management, and you can do a lot of that stuff, and you can look at your Azure AD users through the filter of organizational units. So those are actually kind of cool, come to think of it. But I think that's about the long story short here. This is showing where you're going from on-premises with Azure AD Connect into Azure AD. And then from Azure AD, you're going into the managed domain. And then from there, you're accessing resources in your subscription. I'm really interested to know if any of you use Azure AD Domain Services. Vaibhav, have you had occasion to use this service at all?
I did not. Probably Steve might know if there is anyone in Midwest area who has been using Azure AD.
Yeah, I mean, typically we don't see too much of that. Azure AD Domain Services. Back in the day when we had HD Insight, I don't know if you guys remember what that was. That was if you wanted to do a domain joined HD Insight, that was the only way that was supported to do that, was to stand one of these up. But typically if you need, don't have a domain controller that's on-prem, however, you need Kerberos-based or legacy authentication protocols, like was shown in the first slide. That's typically when you'll need to use that. But odds are, it's a lesser used of the Azure service, but it's there if you need it.
Yeah, and that's good. Better to have it there and not need it than need it and not have it there. All right, what's this showing? AD Connect, B2B, B2C. I think I showed the lion's share of that. I can go back to the portal one more time. I used the Azure Docs to run through one of their quick starts. Let me go over to App Services. And there's a quick start on how to deploy a ASP.NET web application that uses Azure AD Auth. And it's got a couple cool things built into it. So I built the project locally, and then I just used the Visual Studio deploy tools to go up into app service. And so in the app service, of course, a lot of the benefits that it gives developers is, you can do this with VMs nowadays too, but application insights, we mentioned the system assigned identity. But this is kind of interesting too, this feature called App Service Authentication. By default, it's anonymous access enabled because your app service is by definition considered a public accessible web app. That means number one, your developers are going to have to add authentication and authorization themselves. Or number two, you could do an app service environment, which is pretty dadgum expensive, but that would allow you to take your app service plan and your web apps and put them in an air-gapped environment on a virtual network. But this feature is pretty cool because it's meant to help developers in a situation where you're using app service here and you want to be able to do that business to consumer type identity federation. This is very similar to the experience that you see in the Azure B2C tenant, as a matter of fact. But these parts and pieces are baked into app service, which is pretty cool. So Azure Identity, Microsoft, Facebook. In this example, it already has the authentication stuff built into the source code, so I didn't take advantage of this feature, but this is always there. Let me come back to the overview page. This sample app, when you browse to it, it's just, simple hello world kind of deal. We hit it anonymously originally, and then we've got this button to hit the sign-in page. And this is using Azure AD, although the button might lead you to think it was using something like, the social media stuff. It's not. It's just going to do a login.microsoftonline.com request. I'm already signed in as Tim at timw.info, so it took me right in. And the source code of this sample app allows you to see the specific details in your token. Because I'm not a developer, but my understanding of single sign-on, true single sign-on, is that whereas in local AD, you've got NTLM, which is certainly very proprietary to Microsoft, and Kerberos, which is technically community open source, but it's still relatively proprietary. The idea of token-based federation is that your security principles, like a user, is going to be represented. I literally draw a token shape. It could be JSON or XML under the hood, but it serves as a badge effectively to denote who the user is, and then any metadata that's part of the federation trust relationship between the identity provider on one side and the trusted party, the trusting party on the other. So in this case, the trusting party would be my app, and the identity source in this case is Azure Active Directory. Okay. So I think that's about it, actually. Let me go back to PowerPoint. Questions, answers. Yeah, so my takeaway that I offer you is that you need to understand what's available before you can make an informed choice. I think I read that in a fortune cookie a few nights ago. It's a good general bit of life advice, isn't it? But it fits in nicely with identity. And there's a short link to the session materials, timw.info/Omaha. Thanks very much. I appreciate you all very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions or attempt to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Tim.
Hey, quick question here regarding B2C. You had mentioned Azure subscriptions being isolated for multiple use cases, basically for multi-tenancy. Let's say you actually have the organizational backend, so you've got InfoSec groups that have permissions across a whole group of subscriptions, but you have a team that wants to leverage the B2C for forward-facing identity. I see that you went in and actually assigned that Azure subscription to that B2C Azure tenant. Is there a way to leverage that B2C tenant while maintaining the other back-end management identity with the what would you call it, the resource AD at that point, or
yeah, if I understand your question correctly, yes, you can. And this, I think, is fairly recent-ish. In other words, we can clearly see now that this B2C tenant is sourced from this well, wait a minute. Let's see. We're in timw.info, and if we go to Azure AD B2C, what am I looking for here? I'm sorry. I kind of ran into a dead end. I have a lot more to go with B2C, so I don't want to speak anymore because I'm probably going to create more confusion than clarity. I thought that this was going to give us more centralized control over that tenant, but no, because it is a separate instance, we're going to need to switch on over to that tenant, the B2C tenant. And there you've got your identities. And at this point, let's see if the subscription is propagated. Yeah, so we've got the subscription added. And here now it's just a case of governance through the management scopes. You know, you've got your management group, you've got your subscription, you've got your resource groups and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, that tenant is really the top level of the management hierarchy. You know, I like to show a particular picture of it. Let me quickly find it. Azure Management Scopes. Let's see. I think it's in this article here. What is RBAC?
Yeah.
Yeah, this picture right here. The fact that all resources go into a resource group. All resources groups roll up to the subscription. You can do multi-subscription management at the management group scope, and there really should be one level above this shown called the tenant root, and that is associated directly with your Azure AD B2C or Azure AD tenant, and that's going to be above all of the other scope levels.
Okay.
I don't think you can go above. Maybe if you have an enterprise agreement, but I don't know. I don't have enough experience on that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're leveraging a standard Azure AD tenant for global administration for a bunch of different subscriptions, and then one group wants to do B2C, that does essentially pull them out of that larger centralized Azure tenant. I was just kind of curious if there was. Now, I understand you could probably do B2B relationship from that B2C tenant and use policy to enforce and still get permissions into it, but just wondering if there's anything a little bit more cleaner or how should I say, automatically filtering down.
Yes, I understand. I think you're exactly right. Probably the best we can hope for, unless there's a solution I'm aware of, is like you said, you can invite users from the other tenants into the B2C tenant using Azure AD Business to Business. That's certainly possible. And you can do that with bulk nowadays, in bulk, which is easier than just doing it individually. Anything else?
Hey, Tim, could you talk about the external identities feature for Azure AD a little bit and how that might differ from Azure AD B2C?
Okay, let me go back to my home tenant. If I understand you, when you say external identities, are you referring to users who come in as guests?
No, back on that previous screen, there's a separate blade called external identities.
Oh, okay. Let's go back to the B2C tenant.
Or it was in that previous screen that you were on. Back one more.
Oh, yes. Okay, so here we're looking at the B2C tenant properties, users, groups, external identities.
Yeah.
Building on the B2B, it looks, at first blush, it looks like B2B collaboration with the Google Federation maybe baked into it. I'm not sure. This is something, I've got something to put on my to research list. Thanks for bringing this to my attention. B2C external identities.
Cool,
Yeah.
thanks.
Hey Tim, did you play around those new administrative units which are in preview?
No, that's something else. I'm not even aware of that. Can you speak a little bit more about it?
I have not played, but I was looking into it. It shows when I was looking into our AD tenant, it shows administrative units in preview. And what I just glanced at the blade, I thought probably it is something to do with the organizational units that we used or use that we used to have. I might be
okay.
mistaken. I might be mistaken, but it looks like here they are.
Yeah, I've set that up.
Oh. Okay. I'll be darned. It does appear at first blush.
Because it says on the documentation, it's a collection of users and groups.
Wow. So it looks like we are getting a step towards greater parity, future parity, between local AD and Azure AD. The fact that, as I had mentioned, Azure AD being a flat user space, this is going to allow you to separate users and groups that may be part of different businesses or whatever. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and Frank says in the comment that your admin units are like OUs and they allow you to cordon off objects to specific departments in and all.
Yeah, I set this up for a customer just recently, just to give you a use case. So large parent organization, global, going around buying up a lot of smaller organizations. And so we're helping them do migrations, as part of a mergers and acquisitions activity into the main tenant that they have. But the small organizations generally tend to have their own IT departments and their own admins that they want to keep. So we configured a admin unit and brought in all of the users because they also kept their own custom domain, right? So the parent company was Contoso, and we brought in Fabricam. The users kept Fabricam, and we brought them all into an AU. And then assigned roles to Fabricam's admins to just manage that AU. So think of it like OU, very much like an OU, a little bit more limited right now. So things you can't do dynamic membership into an AU, so you do have to do it manually. I think the dynamic membership is coming at some point, but for right now, you can do a bulk import through a CSV file. So that was fairly straightforward, and you can do users groups. And then you can assign, the roles you can assign are like authentication administrator, user administrator, group administrator, and there's a couple of others. Like you can't give global admin rights, for instance, to an AU, but you can do these sub roles.
Okay.
And limited administration. Very useful.
Wow.
Even in the preview stage.
Sounds very powerful.
Yeah.
This is interesting. Normally, when you see the preview tag, you see it once. Look here, every single setting has the preview tag. It's like Microsoft really wants us to know that this is in public preview status. Yeah. I'm surprised you're using it with a customer. I know that's informally a thing to do, and that some product teams will offer production support for public preview features, but normally the preview terms of use, I think it's in all caps. It's crazy. Azure.
Yeah, I think, well, from what I learned from our Microsoft relationship is anything in public preview is fully supported. Things
is that
are
what they say?
Yeah, that's what I was told. If it's
that's surprising to me because
I would make sure that, like, I don't know, if you have premier level support, you reach out to your TAM, because I think your mileage may vary on some of those previews. Yeah. So
yeah,
but like I know, like Blueprints, for instance, is previews, but I've reached out to the product team, says, yeah, don't worry about it. It's going to be fully supported. So feel free to use it. But yeah, I'll just say your mileage may vary.
And where I heard that, if I'm not mistaken, was from Alex Simons, who's the corporate director for the identity group.
Sure.
So as far as Azure AD is concerned, if coming from Alex Simons, if it's public preview, it's fully supported. I can't vouch for anything else in Azure.
Yep.
That's right.
That's what you need. So as long as the product group will support it, because in the end, if our normal support channels can't support it, it will go up to the product group, and if they're going to support it, then we're all good. So
yeah, if any of you have any tips on learning when a product group will do support on public preview and when they're not, the closest I can come to consistency is just checking the Azure updates. And like, I remember Azure Migrate reached a certain level in public preview where the team was doing production support, and I learned by reading their blog post, which I happened to find on the Azure update stream. I wish it was more consistent, but like you said, your mileage may vary. It really seems to be entirely up to the individual engineering teams.
That is correct. Yep. I wish it was easier than that. There was a nice dashboard that we could look at, but there's really not. Even internally to Microsoft, I have to go out and check. So,
Yeah, the blueprints is an interesting case because the Azure blueprints are on a lot of the Azure certification exams, and Microsoft Worldwide Learning has in writing that they don't cover public preview features. And I asked them directly why they'd have blueprints on the exam, and their answer was, well, it's close enough to GA. Okay.
It's been close enough since so many months.
yeah, classic.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. I think we don't have any more questions. At least I don't see any more in the chat.
Okay.
It was a great session, Tim. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me. I love talking shop. This is really great stuff.